Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy learned early that wood remembers everything. The grain tells stories. Where the tree stood, which winds bent it, how many winters it survived. Samuel's small hands first touched oak shavings in a workshop that smelled of sweat and sap, where sunlight fell through gaps in the roof and made the sawdust glow like scattered gold. His father had worked the docks. Strong arms, careful feet, eyes that watched the cargo swinging overhead. One afternoon, those eyes looked away for a heartbeat too long. A rope snapped. The longshoreman carried what remained home wrapped in canvas, and Samuel's mother wept into her apron for 3 days before rising to take in more washing. He was 9 years old, and understood that the world breaks people as easily as it breaks rope. Charleston's waterfront district smelled like tar and fish and human effort. The streets near the wharves held families who worked with their hands: dock workers, sailmakers, carters, coopers. The houses leaned against each other like tired men. Samuel's mother scrubbed linens for merchant wives who lived in the tall houses with piazzas facing the harbor breeze. She came home with raw knuckles and a few coins that never quite stretched far enough. He began helping where he could, running messages for a penny, sweeping shop floors, carrying buckets. The city revealed itself in layers. The gleaming merchant exchanges where men in fine coats argued over bills of lading. The slave market where he learned to look away. The taverns where sailors spent their wages on rum and stories. He moved through it all quietly, a small figure learning to read the currents of power and money that flowed through the port like an invisible tide. Master Hewitt's cooperage stood 3 streets back from the waterfront. The old craftsman made barrels for the shipping trade, tight casks for rum and wine, slack barrels for rice and pitch, massive hogsheads that took 2 men to roll. Samuel had passed the shop countless times, drawn by the rhythmic hammer-on hoop sounds and the sweet smell of fresh-cut wood. One morning when he was 12, he stood in the doorway until Master Hewitt noticed him. "You plan to grow roots there, boy?" "I can work, sir. I'm strong enough." The cooper looked him over. Thin arms, steady gaze, clothes patched but clean. "Your mother know you're here?" "She knows I need a trade." Master Hewitt grunted. The apprenticeship papers were drawn up that week. 7 years of service in exchange for training, room, board, and a new suit of clothes at the end. Samuel's mother signed with an X, her hand shaking. He kissed her cheek and carried his few belongings to the loft above the workshop. The work was harder than dock labor. His hands blistered, then calloused. He learned to select wood by sound and weight. White oak for tight cooperage, pine for slack. The staves had to be shaped just so, beveled at precise angles to form a watertight seal when the hoops were driven down. Master Hewitt was exacting and patient in equal measure. He taught Samuel that sloppy work killed reputations, and reputations were all a craftsman owned. "See this?" The old man held up a stave with a faint crack. "Looks sound enough. Put it in a barrel. 6 months later, it's leaking rum all over some merchant's hold. Who does he blame? The cooper. Not the wood, not the weather, the man who made it. Remember that." Samuel remembered everything. How to bend the staves over fire without scorching them. How to gauge the proper tightness of an iron hoop. Which woods worked for which cargoes. The marks that different coopers used to sign their work. Master Hewitt's mark was a simple H inside a circle, stamped into the barrel head with a hot iron. Samuel studied it like scripture. The years passed in curls of wood and the rasp of draw knives. He grew taller, stronger, more skilled. His mother visited on Sundays when she could, bringing small cakes she could barely afford. She looked older each time, her back bent from the washtubs. Samuel gave her what coins he earned from small side jobs, though apprentices earned almost nothing. She never complained, neither did he. At 15, he completed his first barrel without supervision. Master Hewitt inspected every joint, every hoop, filled it with water, and left it overnight to check for leaks. In the morning, the ground beneath was dry. The old cooper nodded once, which was as close as he came to praise. "You're learning, boy. Keep your pride in your work, not in yourself. Pride in work makes you better. Pride in yourself makes you careless." Samuel learned other lessons, too, unspoken ones. He watched merchants inspect the barrels, running their hands over the wood, checking Master Hewitt's mark. That mark meant something. Quality, reliability, honesty. It opened doors and secured contracts. A good reputation built slowly, barrel by barrel, year by year. A bad one spread like fire through dry grass. He saw how the world sorted itself. The merchants who ordered barrels never touched tools themselves. They wore silk waistcoats and spoke of profit margins. The coopers who made those barrels worked in leather aprons and spoke of wood and weather. The enslaved men who rolled those barrels onto ships had no choice in any of it. Samuel occupied the middle space, neither powerless nor powerful, learning that his survival depended on pleasing those above while staying invisible to those who might see him as threat or opportunity. Master Hewitt sometimes spoke of his own apprenticeship, decades past. "A craftsman serves 3 masters, boy. The work itself, which demands excellence. The customer, who demands value. And his own conscience, which demands honesty. You can cheat 2 of those for a while. Never all 3. In his 17th year, Samuel began to dream beyond the workshop. Not grand dreams, he knew his station, but modest ones. His own shop someday. Enough income to move his mother from the waterfront tenement to a better street. Perhaps a wife, children, a life built on steady work and careful choices. The dreams felt distant as England itself, but they gave shape to the endless days of labor. Master Hewitt's health began to fail that year. A cough that wouldn't clear, hands that trembled when cold. He taught with greater urgency, as if running out of time to pass along everything he knew. Samuel absorbed it all, understanding without being told that he was receiving something precious, not just skills, but a way of seeing the world. Every barrel was a problem to solve. Every problem had a solution if you thought carefully enough and worked honestly enough. The old cooper died in early spring, quietly, in his sleep. Samuel found him in the morning and sat with the body until the parish men came. Master Hewitt's widow sold the cooperage to pay debts. Samuel completed his apprenticeship with a new master across town, finishing out his 7 years. On his final day, he received his suit of clothes and his freedom to work as a journeyman. He stood outside the old workshop that evening, looking at the place where he'd transformed from a grieving child into a skilled craftsman. The building housed a chandler now. The smell of tallow had replaced the scent of wood shavings. Samuel touched the doorframe once, then turned toward the harbor where ships waited, their holds empty of the barrels he would spend his life filling. The city lights reflected on the water. Somewhere out there lay the future, uncertain, challenging, shaped by choices he hadn't yet made. But his hands knew their work. That would be enough. It would have to be. A journeyman cooper belonged everywhere and nowhere. Samuel learned this truth in his first week of freedom, carrying his tools from shop to shop, offering his skills for daily wages. The masters eyed him carefully, too young to trust completely, too skilled to dismiss. He worked 3 days here, a week there, filling in when orders overwhelmed regular staff or when someone took ill. The work changed with each workshop. Old Peter's near the market specialized in rice barrels, the slack cooperage that required less precision but more speed. Samuel made dozens in a day, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind wandered. Goodwin's shop near the brewery produced nothing but hogsheads for ale, each one identical to the last, stamped with the brewer's mark. At Carmichael's cooperage by the shipyards, he learned to make barrels for naval stores, pitch, tar, turpentine, using woods that could withstand the caustic contents. Each master had his own methods, small variations in technique passed down through generations. Some beveled their staves steep, others shallow. Some preferred hickory hoops, others iron. Samuel absorbed it all, building a mental library of approaches. He began to understand that coopering was not one trade, but many, each adapted to its purpose. The pay was irregular. Some weeks brought enough coin to eat well and save a little. Others barely covered his room at a boarding house 3 streets from the wharves. The landlady was a sharp-eyed widow who tolerated no noise after dark and no drinking in the rooms. Samuel kept to himself, speaking pleasantly when spoken to, avoiding entanglements. He'd learned that surviving meant staying unremarkable to those who might cause trouble. Charleston itself was changing, though the shifts came slowly enough that only careful observers noticed. More ships in the harbor each season, new warehouses rising along the waterfront. Merchant houses growing taller and more elaborate, their owners displaying wealth with the casual confidence of men who expected it to continue forever. The gap between those who owned and those who worked widened like a river in flood season. Samuel watched from his particular vantage point. He saw merchants' sons learning their fathers' trades in counting houses, never touching cargo. He saw enslaved craftsmen doing skilled work their masters claimed credit for. He saw poor whites clinging to trades and small properties, terrified of slipping into the mass of propertyless laborers. His own position felt precarious. A skilled tradesman, yes, but one dependent on the goodwill of masters who could dismiss him at any moment. Robert came into his life on a Tuesday morning at Fletcher's cooperage. Another journeyman, a year older, with quick hands and a quicker laugh. They worked side by side for 2 weeks, then 3 months, then found themselves seeking the same jobs. A friendship developed, the careful kind between men who knew competition was built into their circumstances. "You ever think about setting up on your own?" Robert asked one evening over cheap wine in a tavern that catered to tradesmen. "Every day. Need capital, though. Tools, premises, timber stock, contracts. We could partner, pool our savings." Samuel considered it. Partnerships dissolved badly more often than they succeeded. He'd seen it happen. "Maybe. Need more saved first." Robert nodded, not offended. They both understood the calculation. Trust only went so far when survival was at stake. The seasons turned. Samuel worked steadily, building his reputation barrel by careful barrel. Merchants began requesting him specifically, appreciating his precision and reliability. He developed his own maker's mark, a simple S enclosed in a diamond, and began marking his work even though he had no shop of his own. It felt presumptuous, but Master Hewitt's voice echoed in his memory. A craftsman's mark meant something. It was promise and signature both. Margaret appeared in his life like sunlight through morning fog. He first saw her at her father's inn, delivering barrels for the kitchen stores. She was pouring ale for the midday crowd, moving between tables with practiced efficiency. Dark hair pinned up, gray eyes that missed nothing, a slight smile that suggested she found the world more amusing than it deserved. He invented reasons to return, an order to confirm, a measurement to verify. She tolerated his awkward attempts at conversation with bemused patience. Eventually, she laughed at something he said, he could never remember what, and the sound made his chest tight. The courtship proceeded in stolen moments, brief conversations when he delivered barrels, a walk along the waterfront on a Sunday afternoon, carefully chaperoned by her younger sister. Margaret had sharp opinions about everything: politics, religion, the theater, the way merchants underpaid their suppliers. She read books borrowed from a merchant's daughter she served. Samuel found her alternately fascinating and intimidating. Her father was less charmed. Innkeeper Brennan had ambitions for his daughter that did not include a journeyman cooper with no shop and uncertain prospects. He made his feelings clear without raising his voice, a skill men in his position cultivated. Margaret was meant for a merchant's clerk, perhaps a junior partner in a trading house, not a tradesman whose hands bore calluses and whose future remained unwritten. Samuel understood. He'd known from the start it was unlikely. Still, understanding and accepting were different things. He lay awake in his narrow room and calculated obsessively. How many years until he could afford his own shop? How much did premises cost? Could he secure contracts without capital? The numbers never aligned properly. Margaret ended it gently on another Sunday walk. "My father's made arrangements. There's a clerk, Martin's his name, works for a rice factor, good prospects. You want this? She looked at the harbor where ships rode at anchor. Want doesn't figure much into it, does it? For women or for men like us, we make the best choices we can from what's offered. He wanted to argue but found no words that wouldn't sound foolish. She was right. They both knew how the world worked. "I hope you get your shop," she said. "You will, I think. You're patient enough." They parted at her street corner. Samuel walked back to his boarding house feeling hollowed out, understanding he'd been foolish to hope for more than his station allowed. The lesson stung but settled into the collection of hard truths he carried. Work honestly, trust carefully, expect nothing beyond what you can build with your own hands. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity. If marriage and family were beyond reach, at least professional success might not be. He took every job offered, worked longer hours, saved with near fanatical discipline. His reputation grew. Masters began to resent him slightly for being better than their regular staff. Some stopped hiring him. Others hired him more. By his 22nd year, Samuel had accumulated a modest sum. Not enough for a shop, but enough to feel less desperate. He'd learned every variation of cooperage Charleston offered. His barrels bore his mark, and merchants knew it meant quality. He'd learned to navigate the social landscape, deferential to power, fair with equals, kind to those below when kindness cost nothing. Robert had partnered with another journeyman and opened a small shop. The partnership was already showing strain. Samuel felt vindicated in his caution, though he never said so. The city continued its relentless expansion. New wealth poured through the port. Rice, indigo, naval stores flowing out. Manufactured goods, wine, enslaved people flowing in. The machinery of empire and commerce grinding steadily, indifferent to the individual lives caught in its gears. Samuel found himself thinking about Master Hewitt's words more often. Serve the work, the customer, and your conscience. Most men managed two at best. He was determined to honor all three, understanding that this commitment might limit how high he could rise, but would let him sleep at night. His savings grew slowly, his skills sharpened, his reputation solidified. The future remained uncertain, but he was building toward it with the same patient precision he brought to every barrel, one careful choice at a time, trusting that good work eventually yielded good fortune. The tools in his leather satchel were his own now, purchased piece by piece. The mark he stamped into barrel heads carried weight. Somewhere ahead lay the shop he dreamed of, the independence he craved. The path stretched long, but he'd walked difficult paths before. He was learning that a life built slowly might be a life built to last. The shop was smaller than Samuel had imagined during all those years of dreaming, but it was his. 2 rooms on a side street within sound of the harbor, with a yard behind for timber storage and a loft above for living quarters. The lease had taken most of his savings. The tools, benches, and initial timber stock took the rest. He was 30 years old and owned almost nothing except his skills and his name. Widow Parsons, his new landlady, lived in the adjoining house. She was a practical woman who asked no questions about his past and expected rent on time. Her husband had been a sailmaker, dead these 5 years, and she understood the rhythms of waterfront trades. The arrangement suited them both. The first months tested everything Samuel thought he knew about business. Having skills and having customers were different problems entirely. He'd built his reputation as a journeyman, but a journeyman worked for established masters with existing contracts. A man with his own shop needed to find those contracts himself, and merchants were cautious about new ventures. William arrived in the second month, a lanky youth of 16 whose father worked the rice mills. The boy needed a trade, and Samuel needed hands he could afford. The apprenticeship terms were less formal than the ones Samuel had signed years ago, partly because neither had much to offer the other, partly because the world was changing and old certainties felt less certain. "You'll learn proper cooperage," Samuel told him. "No shortcuts, no sloppy work. Your name goes on what you make, same as mine. Understand?" William nodded, eager and terrified in equal measure. Samuel recognized the expression. He'd worn it himself once. The work came gradually. A tavern keeper needed casks for ale. A merchant's factor wanted barrels for pitch. Small orders, the kind established cooperages barely noticed. Samuel took them all and delivered quality that exceeded the price. Word spread slowly through the networks that mattered. Dock workers, carters, warehouse keepers. The cooper on Trad Street did good work. His barrels didn't leak. Thomas Ashford's business came in the 8th month, unexpected and substantial. Ashford was a wine merchant, one of several dozen competing for Charleston's growing thirst for imported spirits. He needed tight cooperage for French wines and Jamaican rum, the kind of work that required real skill. Someone had mentioned Samuel's name. "I'll need to inspect your previous work," Ashford said, standing in the workshop with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Samuel showed him barrels awaiting delivery, let him examine the joinery and ceiling. Ashford was thorough, checking for gaps and testing the hoops. Finally, he nodded. 20 barrels to start. Wine casks, 42 gallons. "Can you deliver in 3 weeks?" It was ambitious, but possible. Samuel quoted a fair price. Ashford agreed without haggling, which was itself unusual. Merchants always haggled. The work consumed those 3 weeks. Samuel and William labored from dawn past dusk, selecting the best white oak, shaping staves with obsessive precision, heating and bending the wood until each barrel was perfectly cylindrical. Samuel stamped each one with his mark, the S in a diamond, and dated them for his own records. Ashford inspected the finished barrels personally, running his hands over every surface, filling one with water to test for leaks. "Excellent work. I'll need 40 more next month, and a standing order after that." The contract transformed Samuel's business. Regular work meant steady income. Steady income meant he could plan beyond next week. He hired another part-time worker, expanded his timber stock, began sleeping more than 4 hours a night. The rhythm of the workshop became the rhythm of his life. Dawn brought the rasp of draw knives and the hammer-on-hoop percussion. Midday meant checking timber deliveries and negotiating with suppliers. Evening was for accounts, maintaining tools, planning tomorrow's work. He fell into bed exhausted and woke the same way, but it was the good exhaustion of building something real. Charleston continued its expansion around him. More merchants, more ships, more money flowing through the port like an endless river. The tension between colonies and crown grew sharper, though Samuel paid it little mind. Taxes and politics were problems for men with property worth protecting. He had barrels to make. The peculiarity appeared on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. Samuel was at the waterfront arranging delivery when he noticed a barrel being loaded onto a merchant vessel. His mark was clearly visible on the head, the S in a diamond. But the barrel itself was wrong. The wood was red oak, not white. The hoops were spaced irregularly. The joinery was competent, but not his style. He approached the dock worker. "Where'd that barrel come from?" The man shrugged. "Warehouse 3. Why?" "Just curious." Samuel examined it more closely when the worker moved on. Definitely his mark, branded clear and deep. But he'd never made this barrel. He was certain. Every barrel he produced was logged in his ledger, timber type and all. Red oak appeared nowhere in his records for wine casks. Perhaps an old barrel from his journeyman days, before he kept detailed records? Possible, but unlikely. He'd always used white oak for tight cooperage, even then. He dismissed it as a curiosity. Memory could be faulty. Perhaps he'd made it and forgotten. The day's work demanded attention. But the second barrel appeared 3 weeks later, and this one removed all doubt. Samuel found it in Ashford's warehouse during a delivery. His mark, his date stamp from 2 months prior. Except he'd never made it. The date stamp showed a Thursday, and his ledger proved he'd been making pitch barrels that entire week using pine. This barrel was oak, constructed for wine. Someone was forging his mark. The realization arrived with cold clarity. Someone was making barrels, stamping them with his signature, and passing them off as his work. The insult stung deeper than theft. A cooper's mark was sacred, the visible proof of his integrity. Forging it was like forging his name on a contract. Samuel's first instinct was anger. His second was caution. Why would anyone forge a relatively unknown cooper's mark? His reputation was growing, but hardly legendary. What advantage did his signature provide? He examined the forged barrel carefully when no one was watching. The construction was good, professionally done. Hidden beneath the wine-stained interior, he found it. A false bottom, cunningly fitted. The barrel's capacity was perhaps 6 gallons less than it appeared. The missing space formed a hidden compartment. Understanding arrived slowly, then all at once. Smuggling. Someone was using barrels with his mark to smuggle goods past customs inspection. His growing reputation for honest work made his signature valuable. A barrel bearing his mark would draw less scrutiny than one from an unknown maker. Samuel stepped away from the barrel, mind racing. This was dangerous knowledge. Smuggling meant customs fraud. Customs fraud meant royal officials, prosecution, possible hanging. The kind of trouble that destroyed lives. He should report it immediately. Except to whom? The customs officials were notoriously corrupt, often complicit in the very smuggling they claimed to prevent. The magistrates were appointed by the crown and favored merchants over tradesmen. The merchants themselves formed an interconnected web of mutual interest and shared profit. William was stacking finished barrels when Samuel returned to the workshop. The boy looked up, cheerful and oblivious. "Everything delivered proper, sir?" "Everything's fine. Keep working." But nothing was fine. Someone was using his name, his reputation, his carefully built integrity for criminal enterprise. If the scheme was discovered, his mark would be evidence. They'd assume his complicity. Years of honest work would mean nothing against the physical proof of barrels bearing his signature and hiding contraband. Samuel pulled his ledger that evening and reviewed every entry. His memory was confirmed. The forged barrels didn't exist in his records. But proving a negative was impossible. How could he demonstrate he hadn't made something when the something existed and bore his mark? He lay awake that night in the loft, listening to the city sounds through the window. Somewhere out there, someone was making barrels with his signature and filling them with secrets. The question that gnawed at him wasn't who or why. The question was what he should do about it, and whether a tradesman with no connections and modest means could do anything at all. The mark he'd stamped on thousands of barrels had always meant quality and honesty. Now, it meant danger. The irony would have been amusing if his entire life weren't suddenly balanced on its edge. Samuel became a student of his own forgery. He couldn't investigate openly. Questions drew attention, and attention meant danger. Instead, he watched and listened, piecing together fragments like assembling a broken barrel from scattered staves. The waterfront taught him patience. Dock workers knew everything that moved through the port, and most would talk if you bought them ale and asked casually. Samuel began spending evenings at the Anchor Tavern, nursing cheap wine and letting conversations flow around him. William thought his master was developing a drinking habit. Widow Parsons made pointed comments about respectable tradesmen keeping respectable hours. The information accumulated slowly. Certain barrels arrived on specific ships and went to specific warehouses. The barrels always bore maker's marks from established coopers, Samuel's among them, but also others. The patterns were subtle enough that only someone looking would notice. Someone was running a systematic operation, using multiple forged marks to avoid drawing attention to any single signature. Jacob Moore proved unexpectedly valuable. He was a warehouse keeper at the Cooper's Point facilities, a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked the waterfront his entire life. Samuel had sold him barrels years ago back in his journeyman days. The old connection provided an excuse for conversation. "Those wine casks that came in last week," Samuel mentioned one afternoon, helping Jacob inventory a shipment. "Saw one with my mark. Don't recall making it, though." Jacob glanced at him, then away. "Memory plays tricks." "Does it? I keep detailed records." "That barrel's not in them." The warehouse keeper was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "Best not to ask questions about things that don't concern you." "It concerns me if someone's forging my mark. You think customs cares whose mark is whose? You make trouble, trouble finds you. That's how this works." Samuel understood the warning. Jacob wasn't threatening him. The man was trying to protect him from forces larger than either of them. But understanding the warning and heeding it were different choices. He began tracking the forged barrels more systematically. Which ships they arrived on, which merchants received them, where they went after Charleston. The pattern that emerged was troubling in its complexity. The operation involved multiple cooperages, various shipping lines, several merchant houses. This wasn't a simple scheme run by one opportunistic trader. This was organized, sophisticated, and protected. The trail kept leading back toward Thomas Ashford's operations, though never conclusively. Ashford received legitimate shipments and suspicious ones. His warehouse handled both wine that paid full customs duty and wine that somehow arrived with paperwork that didn't quite match the cargo.
Samuel wanted to believe his best client was innocent, that the connection was coincidental. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Master Hewitt's voice echoed, "Serve the work, the customer, and your conscience. Never betray the third for the second." Samuel obtained one of the forged barrels through careful maneuvering, claiming it had a defect that needed replacement, offering to repair it personally at no charge. The merchant agreed, happy to have free cooperage. Samuel brought the barrel to his workshop after dark and disassembled it completely. The craftsmanship was excellent, which narrowed the possibilities. Whoever made these barrels was trained, skilled, and had access to quality materials. The false bottom was ingeniously constructed, fitted so precisely that even careful inspection might miss it. The hidden compartment could hold perhaps 5 gallons of liquid or an equivalent volume of goods. William found him at dawn, surrounded by barrel pieces, examining joinery methods with obsessive focus. "Sir, are you well?" Samuel looked up, realizing he'd worked through the night. "Fine. Just studying different techniques." The boy didn't look convinced, but knew better than to press. He set about starting the day's work while Samuel cleaned up the evidence of his investigation. The danger of his situation became clearer with each discovery. If he reported the forgeries and nothing happened, which seemed likely given official corruption, he'd be marked as troublesome. If the authorities actually investigated, he might be implicated. His mark was on the barrels. Proving he hadn't made them would be nearly impossible. Ashford visited the workshop on a gray morning when rain drummed against the roof. He watched Samuel work for several minutes before speaking. "Your reputation continues to grow. I've recommended you to several associates." "I appreciate that, sir. Good work deserves recognition. Though sometimes curiosity gets in the way of good work." Samuel set down his draw knife carefully. "I don't follow." "I heard you've been asking questions at the waterfront about barrels, marks, shipping manifests." Ashford's tone remained pleasant, conversational. "People notice when a cooper becomes interested in things beyond coopering. Just want to protect my reputation. Someone's forging my mark." "Is that so?" "Troubling, if true. Though one has to wonder why anyone would bother forging the mark of a relatively new master, unless that mark has value for some other reason." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Samuel met Ashford's eyes and saw calculation there, a merchant weighing risk and benefit. The conversation was a test, determining how much Samuel knew and how much trouble he intended to cause. "I just want it to stop," Samuel said carefully. "No interest in anyone's business but my own." Wise, very wise. A tradesman who minds his shop prospers. One who meddles in matters beyond his understanding often finds his shop burns down. Tragic accidents happen. Ashford left without placing an order. The message was clear enough. Samuel spent the afternoon considering his options. Back away entirely, accept that his mark was being forged, hope the scheme never collapsed on him. Or continue investigating, gather enough evidence to protect himself, risk everything he'd built. The choice should have been simple. Survival favored caution. But Master Hewitt's lessons ran deeper than pragmatism. A craftsman's mark meant something. It was promise and identity bound together. Letting it be corrupted
felt like surrendering the only thing that made him more than just another pair of hands.
That evening, William asked permission to visit his family for Sunday. Samuel agreed, grateful for the privacy. After the boy left, he pulled out a fresh journal and began documenting everything he'd learned: the ships, the warehouses, the patterns. If he was going to continue this investigation, he needed records that existed beyond his memory. Rebecca entered his awareness by accident. She was Thomas Ashford's bookkeeper, a woman in her middle years who handled accounts and correspondence. Samuel had seen her occasionally at the warehouse, a stern figure in dark dresses who kept the merchant's records with mechanical precision. He noticed her at the Anchor Tavern one evening, sitting alone in a corner with a glass of wine, staring at nothing. Her presence was unusual. Respectable women didn't frequent waterfront taverns, and Rebecca had always seemed the embodiment of respectability. Their eyes met briefly. Something in her expression, exhaustion, perhaps, or despair, made Samuel nod in acknowledgement. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw tears she was trying to hide. The next week she appeared at his workshop, ostensibly to confirm a delivery schedule, but her real purpose became clear when William left to fetch water. "You're investigating the forged barrels." It wasn't a question. Samuel's instinct was to deny everything, but her expression held no threat, only a desperate sort of hope. "What if I am? Then you should know that the ledgers don't match. Ashford keeps 2 sets of books. I maintain them both, the public records and the real ones." "Why are you telling me this?" Rebecca's hands trembled slightly. "Because I've spent 3 years helping him defraud the crown, and I'm tired of being part of it. Because he's promised I'll be compensated for my silence, but I've seen what happens to people who know too much. Because maybe, just maybe, an honest cooper can do what I cannot." She left before Samuel could respond, walking quickly back toward the merchant district. He stood in the empty workshop, understanding that the investigation had just become far more dangerous and far more possible than before. The city's evening bells rang across the rooftops. Samuel returned to his journal and added Rebecca's name along with a note: potential ally or potential trap. In this game he'd stumbled into, trust was the scarcest commodity of all. Rebecca came to his workshop twice more over the following weeks, always with plausible excuses, confirming orders, discussing delivery schedules, requesting minor modifications to barrel specifications. Each time, when William was out of earshot, she passed Samuel information in whispered fragments. The smuggling operation was larger than he'd imagined. Multiple merchant houses coordinated shipments, routing goods through a network of warehouses and sympathetic customs inspectors. French wines arrived, declared as cheaper Portuguese varieties. Fine textiles hid among bales of common cloth. The forged cooperage marks provided a layer of legitimacy. Barrels from known trusted craftsmen drew less scrutiny than those from anonymous makers. "Ashford's not the architect," Rebecca told him during her 3rd visit. "He's one player among several, but he keeps the most detailed records. He doesn't trust his partners, so he documents everything." "Why are you doing this?" Samuel asked. "Helping me, I mean." She looked at him with eyes that held too much weariness for her years. "Because I have a daughter, 15 years old, smart as paint. I want her to have choices I never did. That means she can't have a mother hanged for fraud. I need out before this collapses, and it will collapse.
These schemes always do. Samuel understood.
Rebecca wasn't being altruistic. She was trying to survive, using him as her escape route. The calculation didn't offend him. He was using her the same way. The evidence accumulated in his hidden journal. Shipping dates that matched Rebecca's information. Barrel designs that revealed patterns. Names of merchants, customs officials, ship captains. The picture that emerged showed corruption woven through Charleston's commerce like rot through timber. The political situation complicated everything. Colonial anger at British taxation had grown from grumbling to organized resistance. Merchants who'd once supported the crown now questioned whether they owed loyalty to laws they considered unjust. Smuggling, once simply criminal, had acquired a patina of patriotic defiance. Samuel found himself caught between two narratives. Was Ashford a common criminal evading taxes, or a colonial businessman resisting tyranny? The question mattered less than he'd expected. The forgery of his mark was wrong, regardless of the justification, but the shifting politics made prosecution uncertain. Today's smuggler might be tomorrow's patriot hero. Constable Porter was a careful man who'd survived decades of colonial law enforcement by understanding which battles were worth fighting. Samuel observed him for weeks before making contact, watching how he handled disputes, which merchants he favored, which he treated with professional distance. The constable lived modestly, despite opportunities for enrichment, which suggested either uncommon integrity or exceptional caution. Samuel hoped for the former, expected the latter. They met at a coffee house on a Wednesday morning. Porter listened without interrupting while Samuel laid out the basics: forged marks, hidden compartments, systematic fraud. He didn't mention Rebecca or reveal his most detailed evidence. Not yet. "You understand what you're asking," Porter said finally. "You're accusing prominent merchants of serious crimes, men with connections to the governor, to London trading houses, to families that have run this colony for generations. I'm asking you to investigate forged cooperage marks. Where that leads is your concern." Porter studied him. "Why come forward? You could ignore this, protect your business, avoid trouble." Samuel had anticipated the question. "Because they're using my mark. When this scheme fails, and it will fail, I'll be implicated. I need that on record now, before the collapse." "Self-preservation, then. I can respect that." Porter leaned back. "It'll take time. I need to be careful. Build a case that survives scrutiny. Can you be patient?" "I've been patient my whole life." The investigation proceeded with glacial slowness. Porter was true to his word, careful, methodical, leaving no space for accusations of prejudice or hasty judgment. But careful meant slow. And every day Samuel kept his workshop open and his mouth shut, felt like walking a tightrope above drowning water. Ashford stopped ordering barrels. No explanation, no confrontation, simply silence where there'd been steady business. Other merchants followed. Within a month, Samuel's income had dropped by half. The message was unmistakable: cooperate or suffer consequences. William noticed but said nothing. The boy worked harder, as if effort alone could compensate for vanishing orders. Widow Parsons began asking pointed questions about rent, her tone sympathetic but firm. Samuel paid what he owed and said nothing about his dwindling reserves. The isolation was the hardest part. He couldn't explain to William why business had dried up, couldn't tell Widow Parsons why he persisted in an investigation that was destroying his livelihood. The knowledge he carried felt heavier than any barrel he'd ever lifted. His workshop was vandalized on a moonless night in late spring. He arrived at dawn to find tools scattered, timber stock damaged, his workbench scored with deep gouges. Nothing stolen, just destruction for its own sake. A message written in broken wood and spilled oil. William stood amid the wreckage, young face pale. Who would do this? Doesn't matter. Help me clean up. They worked in silence, salvaging what they could. The material damage was significant but not catastrophic. The psychological impact was worse. Samuel understood he was being warned. Next time might be fire instead of vandalism. Fire would end everything. Rebecca appeared that afternoon, ostensibly checking on a delayed order. Her eyes took in the cleaned-up workshop, the remaining evidence of damage. "I heard. I'm sorry." "Are you?" Samuel's voice came out harsher than intended. "You pushed me toward this. Now I'm paying the price." "I know. And I'm trying to make it worth the cost." She glanced toward William, who was working at the far end of the shop. "I've copied ledger pages, real accounts, showing the full scope. Dates, amounts, names, everything you need." She produced a folded packet from inside her cloak. Samuel took it, the paper feeling impossibly heavy. "If Ashford discovers you've done this, he won't discover it from me. My daughter and I are leaving Charleston. I've accepted a position in Williamsburg, bookkeeping for a legitimate merchant. We leave in 3 days." Samuel felt a surge of anger and abandonment. She was escaping, leaving him to face the consequences of an investigation she'd encouraged. But looking at her face, he saw only exhaustion and fear. She was doing what he'd do in her position, protecting what mattered most. "Thank you," he said, meaning it despite everything. "Don't thank me. Just finish this. Someone needs to." She left without ceremony, and Samuel never saw her again. The ledger pages were explosive. They detailed not just Ashford's operation, but the entire network. Ships, captains, merchants, customs officials, quantities, dates, profits. Rebecca had given him enough evidence to bring down a dozen prominent men. He delivered the documents to Constable Porter the next day. The constable's expression shifted from interest to alarm as he reviewed the pages. "Where did you get these?" "An anonymous source. Someone with access to the real accounts." Porter looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what happens now? Once I move on this, there's no stopping it. These men will fight back with every resource they have. You'll be exposed, questioned, possibly charged yourself as a way to discredit you." "I understand. And you're willing to risk it?" Samuel thought of Master Hewitt's lessons, of his mother's quiet endurance, of the mark he'd stamped on thousands of barrels. Thought of the choice between the life he'd built and the principles that gave that life meaning. "I'm willing," Porter nodded slowly. "Then we'd better do this right. It's going to be a long summer." The investigation became official, carefully at first, then with growing momentum as evidence accumulated. Other witnesses came forward once the constable's involvement became known. Dock workers, junior clerks, a ship's captain with his own grievances. The conspiracy was too large to remain hidden once someone with authority started pulling threads. Samuel kept his workshop open through it all, though business remained scarce. He testified before a magistrate, answering questions while Ashford and his associates glared from across the room. The process was exhausting, humiliating, and necessary. The trial came in autumn, when the air finally lost its suffocating heat. Samuel sat in the gallery and watched justice move with its peculiar combination of theater and tedium. Lawyers argued points of law. Witnesses contradicted each other. The forged barrels were presented as evidence, his mark stark against the wood. The verdict, when it came, was mixed. Ashford was convicted, sentenced to forfeiture of assets and imprisonment. 2 other merchants received similar judgments. Several smaller players turned evidence against their superiors and received lighter sentences. The corrupt customs official had fled to British Florida and was tried in absentia. Samuel's name was cleared officially, though clearing a name and restoring a reputation were different achievements. Half the city saw him as a brave truth-teller. The other half saw him as a troublemaker who'd betrayed his betters. Both perspectives would follow him for years. He walked home from the courthouse alone, through streets that felt both familiar and strange. His workshop waited, empty of orders but intact. William had stayed loyal throughout, though Samuel had given him leave to seek employment elsewhere. The boy had just shaken his head and kept working. Widow Parsons had tea waiting when he arrived. She poured without comment, then sat across from him at her kitchen table. "Was it worth it?" she asked. Samuel considered the question. His business was damaged, possibly beyond recovery. His reputation was complicated. He'd made powerful enemies and uncertain friends. But his mark was his own again, proven honest in a court of law. "Ask me in a year," he said. She smiled slightly. "Fair enough." The year following the trial taught Samuel that vindication and prosperity were distant cousins at best. His name had been cleared in court, but business operated on trusts and perception, neither of which respected legal verdicts. The merchants who'd supported Ashford viewed Samuel as a traitor to their class. Those who'd opposed the smuggling ring appreciated his courage, but hesitated to associate with controversy. Orders came sporadically. A tavern keeper here, a small merchant there, jobs too minor for established cooperages to bother with. Samuel took them all and delivered quality that exceeded the price, same as always. William worked beside him, learning that integrity sometimes meant lean months and uncertain futures. "My father asks why I stay," the boy said one afternoon, fitting hoops with steady hands. "Says there's steadier work elsewhere." "He's not wrong. You're free to go, William. No shame in it." The apprentice shook his head. "You stood up when standing up mattered. Rather learn from a man like that than work for someone who didn't." Samuel felt something catch in his chest. Master Hewitt would have appreciated William's loyalty. The old cooper had believed that character revealed itself in difficult times, not easy ones. The trial had revealed plenty about everyone involved. Constable Porter visited occasionally, ostensibly to check on Samuel's welfare, actually to ensure he wasn't facing retaliation. The constable's presence was both comforting and reminder that danger hadn't entirely passed.
Men with ruined fortunes and grudges sometimes acted rashly. "Ashford's appealing the sentence," Porter mentioned during one visit. "Won't change the outcome, but it keeps things unsettled. You watch yourself." Samuel appreciated the concern, though he'd been watching himself since childhood. Caution was a habit developed early and maintained through necessity. The trial's aftermath rippled through Charleston's commercial life in unexpected ways. Other smuggling operations collapsed as participants feared exposure. Customs inspections grew more rigorous, at least temporarily. Legitimate merchants found their businesses complicated by heightened scrutiny. Some blamed Samuel for disrupting comfortable arrangements. Others grudgingly acknowledged that corruption exposed was better than corruption unchecked. Rebecca's letters arrived from Williamsburg, brief notes confirming her safe arrival and new employment. She never mentioned the trial or her role in it, keeping her correspondence determinedly ordinary. Samuel understood. She'd built a new life and wanted no ties to the old one. He replied with equal brevity, then stopped writing entirely. Some connections were meant to end cleanly. The financial strain grew severe as summer approached. Samuel had depleted his savings during the investigation, and insufficient income couldn't rebuild them. He let the part-time worker go with regrets and fair payment. Considered dismissing William too, but the boy refused to discuss it. Widow Parsons showed unexpected mercy regarding rent. "Pay what you can when you can. You did right, and right sometimes costs more than wrong. I won't punish you for it." Her kindness embarrassed him more than threats would have. He managed partial payments and promised the rest later, knowing she needed the money as much as he needed the premises. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Captain Marcus Hendricks commanded a merchant vessel trading between Charleston and Boston, a practical man who valued reliability over politics. He'd lost cargo in one of Ashford's schemes and remembered Samuel's testimony about the forged barrels. "Need a cooper I can trust," Hendricks said, appearing at the workshop one morning. "Someone who won't hide contraband in my cargo and risk my ship to customs seizure. Hear you're that man." "I try to be." "Good enough. I need barrels for rum, molasses, rice. Steady orders, fair prices, payment on delivery. Interested?" Samuel was interested. Hendricks became his anchor client, providing regular work that stabilized the business. Other ship captains followed, drawn by Hendricks's recommendation and their own need for trustworthy cooperage. The shipping trade proved more forgiving than the merchant houses. Sailors understood that survival sometimes required difficult choices. William matured visibly through that period, developing the judgment that separated adequate craftsmen from excellent ones. He learned to read wood grain like text, understanding what each tree had to teach. Samuel began trusting him with complete barrels, marking William's work with a secondary signature that acknowledged his growing skill. The Coopers Guild held a quarterly meeting that autumn. Samuel had attended sporadically, never quite comfortable among established masters who'd inherited their positions rather than fighting for them. This time, old Master Fletcher called him forward before the assembled craftsmen. This man stood up when standing up cost him everything. Defended his mark, exposed corruption, accepted the consequences. That's what guilds are supposed to be about. Maintaining standards, protecting integrity. We should acknowledge it.
The formal recognition meant more than Samuel expected. Not all the masters applauded. Some still viewed him as troublemaker, but enough did that his position in the trade felt solid again. He was no longer just the cooper who'd testified against Ashford. He was a master craftsman whose integrity had been tested and proven. Business gradually improved, not to the levels before the trial, but steadily upward. Samuel hired another apprentice, a girl whose father had died, leaving her without prospects. The Coopers' Guild frowned on female apprentices, but Samuel's reputation for unconventional choices was already established. The girl, Anne, proved quick-handed and careful, asking questions that showed she thought about the work rather than just performing it. The political situation grew more turbulent as colonial resistance to British authority intensified. Talk of independence, once whispered, was now debated openly in taverns and meeting houses. Samuel listened more than he spoke, understanding that tradesmen who chose the wrong side too vocally could find themselves targeted, regardless of which side eventually won. His life acquired a rhythm different from before the trial, but satisfying in its own way. The workshop hummed with activity. William and Anne worked with increasing skill. Captain Hendricks brought regular orders and occasional news from other ports. Widow Parsons's rent was paid in full and on time. Samuel even managed to save small amounts again, building toward a security that felt more earned than his earlier prosperity. A letter arrived from his mother's old neighbor, informing him that she'd passed quietly in her sleep. The news arrived 3 weeks after the burial, too late for Samuel to attend. He sat with the letter for a long time, remembering her raw hands and patient endurance, the sacrifices she'd made so he could apprentice properly. She'd lived long enough to know he'd established his own shop. He hoped that had mattered to her. He visited her grave on a Sunday morning, placing wildflowers on the simple marker. The cemetery overlooked the harbor where his father had died decades earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate somehow. They'd both worked themselves to death so he could have choices they'd never possessed. One final discovery waited, mundane in its arrival, but significant in its implications. Samuel found it while reorganizing his timber stock, a barrel hidden behind stacked lumber, forgotten or deliberately concealed. His mark showed clearly, but he'd never made it. Another forgery, likely the last remnant of Ashford's operation. He examined it carefully. The hidden compartment remained, though whatever it had contained was long gone. The barrel itself was evidence of crimes already prosecuted, technically meaningless now, but its existence troubled him. Were there others? Had the investigation truly uncovered everything, or just the visible portion? He brought it to Constable Porter, who sighed at the sight of it. Probably the end of the line. We seized most of them during the trials. This one got missed somehow. What should I do with it? Porter considered. Burn it, or keep it as a reminder. Either way, it's just wood now. The men who mattered have been judged. Samuel chose to keep it, storing the barrel in the back of his workshop. Occasionally, he'd look at it, remembering how close he'd come to being destroyed by someone else's crime. The barrel became a kind of monument, not to his courage, which he'd never felt particularly brave, but to the importance of small choices made consistently over time. His mark had been forged, his reputation attacked, his business nearly ruined. but he'd survived by insisting that integrity mattered even when maintaining it carried costs. Master Hewitt would have nodded approval. That thought gave Samuel more satisfaction than any amount of recovered prosperity ever could. Charleston continued its restless evolution around him. New tensions, new opportunities, new conflicts between old orders and emerging ones. Samuel made barrels and trained apprentices, paid his debts and kept his word, participated in the city's life without being consumed by it. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty was nothing new. He had built a life from it before. He could do it again if necessary, one careful barrel at a time. Spring brought Eliza into Samuel's life with the inevitability of seasons changing. She owned a bakery 3 streets over, a practical establishment that served working people rather than merchant families. Samuel had bought bread there occasionally, exchanging pleasantries with the proprietor without thinking much about it. But Widow Parsons, who believed prolonged bachelorhood indicated questionable judgment, arranged a dinner that included Eliza and made her intentions transparent. "She's sensible," Widow Parsons said beforehand. "Widowed young, built her business from nothing. No nonsense about her. You could do worse." Samuel suspected he could also do better. But Eliza's company proved unexpectedly comfortable. She spoke plainly about her life, a brief marriage to a ship's carpenter who'd drowned in a storm, the struggle to keep the bakery operating alone, the satisfaction of work done well. Her hands bore the same kind of scars his did, marks of labor that couldn't be hidden. They began meeting for occasional meals, conversations that felt more like negotiations than courtship. Both had been shaped by loss and hard work. Neither believed in romantic illusions. What they offered each other was partnership, practical support, someone who understood that survival required effort and compromise. "I won't pretend to be someone I'm not," Eliza said during one of their walks along the waterfront. "I'm busy, opinionated, and set in my ways. But I'm loyal, and I don't waste time on foolishness." "I'm much the same," Samuel admitted. "Except I'm told I'm too quiet and too careful. Quiet and careful sounds restful after my first husband, who was neither." The courtship proceeded without drama. They were both past the age where passion overwhelmed judgment. What grew between them was respect, affection, and the recognition that life was easier with a reliable partner than without one. They married in a simple ceremony attended by Widow Parsons, William, Anne, and a handful of friends from their respective trades. The marriage changed Samuel's daily life in small, significant ways. Eliza's bakery and his cooperage remained separate businesses, but they coordinated schedules and shared evening meals. Her practicality balanced his tendency toward excessive caution. His steadiness countered her occasional impulsiveness. They fit together like well-made barrel staves, each supporting the other's weight. William had become a full partner in the cooperage by then, his skills now equal to Samuel's own. The formal partnership papers gave the younger man a stake in the business and acknowledged what had long been true. They worked as equals, not master and apprentice. Anne showed similar promise, though her path remained constrained by a world that didn't easily accept female craftsmen. "She's better than half the journeymen I've seen," William observed. "Shame she'll never get full recognition for it." Samuel agreed, but had no solution. He could train Anne, pay her fairly, mark her work with acknowledgement. He couldn't change the guild's attitudes or society's expectations. Some injustices were beyond individual correction. The business continued its steady recovery. Captain Hendricks's regular orders had attracted other shipping trade. Samuel's reputation for integrity, once a liability, had become an asset. Merchants who valued honest dealing sought him out. Those who preferred flexible arrangements went elsewhere. The sorting felt appropriate. The discovery came on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. Samuel was reorganizing the storage loft, moving older materials to make space for new timber deliveries. Behind a stack of staves he'd purchased years earlier, he found a small barrel he'd never seen before. His mark showed clearly on the head. The barrel was old, the wood weathered, but the construction was unmistakable, a forgery from Ashford's operation. And from the weight, it wasn't empty. Samuel carried it down to the workshop carefully. William looked up from his work, saw Samuel's expression, and set down his tools. "Another one? Appears so." They examined it together. The false bottom was there, still intact. Samuel pried it open carefully, uncertain what he'd find after all these years. Documents, rolled tightly and wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. Samuel unrolled them on his workbench, and both men leaned close to read. Ledgers. Not Rebecca's copies, but originals, showing transactions that had never been presented at trial. Names Samuel recognized, merchants, officials, even a magistrate who'd presided over other cases. The scope was larger than what had been prosecuted. Ashford's operation had been one branch of a much more extensive network. "Should we take this to Constable Porter?" William asked. Samuel studied the documents, his mind working through implications. The trial was years past. Most of the principals were imprisoned, fled, or ruined. Reopening the investigation would require enormous effort and political will. It might expose corruption, or it might simply create more enemies without achieving justice. He thought about Master Hewitt's teachings. Serve the work, the customer, and your conscience. But also about Eliza's practicality, about the life he'd built, about the people who depended on him. "Yes," he said finally, "but carefully. These names include powerful men. We need to do this right." Constable Porter had aged visibly since the trial. Gray showed in his hair now, and his movements carried the weariness of a man who'd fought too many battles against entrenched corruption. "More evidence. Of course there is." He examined the documents with professional thoroughness. "This complicates things. Some of these men are dead. Others have been investigated and cleared. Opening old cases creates problems. Should I have burned it?" Porter looked at him sharply. "Would you have?" "No." "Then you already knew what needed doing." The constable sighed. "I'll handle this quietly. Some cases can be pursued, others can't. But having this on record matters. Truth doesn't always lead to justice, but it's worth preserving anyway." The investigation that followed was muted. Nothing like the dramatic trial years earlier. Some officials retired suddenly. A few merchants restructured their businesses under pressure. No new trials, but quiet acknowledgments that the original prosecution had only scratched the surface. Samuel's role remained largely private this time. He'd learned that heroism attracted attention, and attention carried costs. Better to act quietly, let others take credit, focus on the work that sustained him. The Coopers' Guild held its annual banquet that summer,
a formal affair Samuel usually avoided. This year, old Master Fletcher insisted he attend. The evening proved tedious until Fletcher stood to address the gathering.
We recognize this year a craftsman who exemplifies what our guild claims to value: quality work, honest dealing, protection of our craft's reputation. Master Samuel has demonstrated these principles through difficult circumstances. The guild commends him. The applause was genuine, even from masters who'd once viewed him with suspicion. Samuel accepted the recognition with appropriate modesty, understanding it represented more than personal achievement. It was acknowledgement that integrity could survive in a world that didn't always reward it. Eliza teased him gently on the walk home. "My husband, the celebrated craftsman. Should I curtsy when you enter the room?" "Only if I curtsy when you bake exceptional bread." "Everything I bake is exceptional." "Then we'll both be curtsying constantly. The neighbors will think us strange." Their laughter echoed through the quiet streets. Samuel realized with some surprise that he was happy. Not the desperate, fragile happiness of someone who'd nearly lost everything, but the steady contentment of someone who'd built something worth protecting. The workshop continued its rhythm. William trained a new apprentice, while Anne's skills grew to match any journeyman's. Captain Hendricks brought regular orders and stories from distant ports. Widow Parsons maintained her watchful presence next door. Eliza's bakery filled mornings with the smell of fresh bread. Samuel's hair showed gray now, and his hands bore the accumulated scars of decades of work. But those hands remained steady, capable of the precise work that transformed wood into containers that held what mattered: wine, grain, water, trade goods, the material substance of human commerce and connection. His mark appeared on barrels throughout the colonies now, carried on ships to ports he'd never see. Each one bore his signature honestly, a promise that what he'd made would serve its purpose without deception or failure. In a world of uncertain loyalties and shifting allegiances, that simple reliability meant something. The past remained present in small ways. The forged barrel he kept as reminder. Occasional letters from Rebecca, updating him on her respectable life in Virginia. Memories of his mother's sacrifices and Master Hewitt's lessons. But the past didn't dominate. It informed the present without overwhelming it. Samuel stood in his workshop one evening after the others had gone, running his hand over a completed barrel. The wood was smooth, the joints precise, the hoops perfectly tensioned. Good work, honest work, the kind that let a man sleep soundly and wake without shame. Outside, Charleston continued its restless transformation. Inside, a cooper practiced his trade with the same attention he'd brought to it for decades. The world turned, seasons changed, empires rose and fell. But some things remained constant: the grain of wood, the integrity of craftsmanship, the satisfaction of work done right. That was enough. It had always been enough. The young apprentice's hands trembled as he fitted the final hoop, uncertain whether to drive it down with confidence or caution. Samuel watched from his stool near the window, where morning light fell across his workbench in familiar patterns. The boy was perhaps 14, still learning that cooperage required both strength and delicacy, force applied with precision. "Don't hesitate," Samuel said quietly. "The wood knows when you're unsure.
Commit to the strike, or don't strike at all." The boy nodded, adjusted his grip, and brought the hammer down properly. The hoop seated with a satisfying sound. Samuel felt something settle in his chest. Not pride exactly, but recognition that teaching continued what had been taught to him decades earlier. Master Hewitt's lessons lived on through hands that had never known the old cooper. The workshop held 3 apprentices now, along with William as full partner, and Anne, whose unofficial status as master craftswoman was acknowledged by everyone except the guild's formal records. The space hummed with productive activity, barrels in various stages of completion arranged like a wooden forest. Eliza brought lunch most days, bread from her morning baking, accompanied by cheese or cold meat. They ate together in the yard when weather permitted, speaking of small matters, supply costs, neighborhood gossip, the apprentices' progress. Their marriage had settled into comfortable routine, neither passionate nor contentious, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of work's demands. "You're slowing down," she observed one afternoon, not critically, but as simple fact. Samuel couldn't deny it. His hands remained skilled, but they tired more quickly. His back protested long hours at the workbench. The endless physical demands of cooperage had accumulated across decades, leaving their mark on muscle and bone. "Still good for a few years yet. I'm not suggesting you stop, just noting what is. We're neither of us young anymore." True enough. Samuel had entered his 40th year, which felt simultaneously impossible and entirely reasonable. The boy who'd swept Master Hewitt's workshop felt like someone else entirely, separated by time and experience into a different person. Yet continuity existed. The same hands, the same dedication to craft, the same understanding that good work mattered regardless of who noticed. Charleston itself showed signs of age and change. The political tensions that had simmered for years were approaching some kind of resolution, though what form that resolution would take remained unclear. Talk of independence had moved from tavern speculation to serious planning. Samuel listened and formed no strong opinions. Empires came and went. Craftsmen endured. Captain Hendricks visited less frequently now, his trading routes disrupted by increasing tensions between colonies and crown. Other clients had emerged to replace that business, but the shift signaled larger transformations. The comfortable commercial world Samuel had known was fragmenting, reorganizing itself according to new principles and allegiances. William had married the previous year, a cooper's daughter from Savannah who'd moved north with her family. The young couple lived above the workshop, continuing the tradition of craftsmen's families inhabiting their workspaces. Samuel heard their voices in the evening sometimes, laughter and occasional arguments that reminded him his workshop would continue after he no longer stood at its center. Anne had received an offer from a merchant in Philadelphia, a man progressive enough to hire a female cooper if her skills warranted it. She was considering the opportunity, torn between loyalty to Samuel's workshop and the chance for recognition impossible in Charleston. "You should go," Samuel told her. "Loyalty is valuable, but so is opportunity. I won't be insulted. You gave me a chance when no one else would, and you've repaid that many times over. Go build your own reputation. That's what apprenticeship is for. Learning enough to leave." She would decide in her own time. Samuel understood that his opinion, while valued, wasn't determinative. Anne had developed the judgment that separated adequate craftsmen from exceptional ones. Whatever she chose would be reasoned and appropriate. The forged barrel remained in the workshop's back corner, a monument to dangers survived and lessons learned. Occasionally, Samuel would look at it, remembering those tense years when his integrity and survival had seemed mutually exclusive.
The barrel reminded him that difficult choices sometimes yielded unexpected rewards, though the rewards rarely came quickly or obviously. Constable Porter had retired, replaced by a younger man less interested in historical corruption than current order. The transition felt appropriate. The smuggling scandal belonged to the past now, its principles dead or scattered, its lessons absorbed into Charleston's complicated memory. Samuel's role had become footnote rather than headline, which suited him perfectly. Rebecca's letters had ceased years ago. Samuel sometimes wondered about her daughter, whether the girl had gotten those choices Rebecca had sacrificed so much to provide. He hoped so, though hoping changed nothing. People drifted apart, lives diverged. The connections that had once seemed essential faded into pleasant memories or useful lessons. His own mother's grave received regular visits, flowers placed with the same careful attention he brought to his cooperage. The cemetery had expanded significantly, filling with Charleston's dead as the city itself grew larger and more complex. His father's resting place was somewhere in the potter's field near the docks, unmarked and forgotten except in Samuel's memory. The inequality bothered him less now than it once had. The dead cared nothing for markers or ceremonies. Those rituals comforted the living. Master Hewitt's lessons echoed constantly, emerging in moments of decision or uncertainty. Serve the work, the customer, and your conscience. Check for cracks that aren't obvious. Pride in work makes you better. Pride in yourself makes you careless. The old cooper's voice had become indistinguishable from Samuel's own thoughts. A legacy absorbed so completely, it felt like original insight. One afternoon in late summer, Samuel completed a barrel with William watching. The younger man had seen Samuel make thousands of barrels, but he attended this one with particular focus. "Why are you staring?" "Watching how you finish the rim. You do something different, but I can't identify what." Samuel looked at his own hands, trying to observe what he did unconsciously. "Slight angle on the final pass. Learned it from Master Hewitt, though I've modified it over the years. Makes the seal tighter." "Can you teach me?" "I thought I had been teaching you." "You've been showing me. Teaching requires explaining." The distinction was valid. Samuel spent the next hour breaking down the technique into components, explaining what his hands knew but his mind had never articulated. Teaching forced him to examine his own methods, understanding them freshly. William absorbed the lesson with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and Samuel felt satisfaction that extended beyond mere transfer of technique. This was continuity, craft preserved and passed forward. The city's evening sounds drifted through the open workshop door as they finished the day's work. Church bells marking the hour, vendors calling final sales, the constant background murmur of human activity that defined urban life. Samuel had spent his entire existence within these sounds, shaped by Charleston's rhythms as surely as trees were shaped by prevailing winds. Eliza was waiting when he climbed the stairs to their rooms above the bakery. Simple dinner, quiet conversation, the companionship of people who'd learned to coexist comfortably. She mentioned a letter from her sister in Virginia. He told her about the technique he'd taught William. Neither topic was significant, but significance wasn't the point. The point was presence, routine, the small ways people built lives together. Later, unable to sleep, Samuel stood at the window overlooking the street. The city was never entirely dark. Lanterns marked doorways and street corners. The harbor glowed with ship lights and warehouse fires. Somewhere out there, barrels he'd made were being filled, shipped, emptied, refilled. His marks circulated through commercial networks that spanned oceans, a signature repeated thousands of times on objects that served purposes he'd never witness. The thought pleased him, not because it suggested importance — he knew his place in the world's machinery — but because it represented competence, sustained across decades. He'd done what he set out to do, made good barrels, trained apprentices properly, maintained his integrity when maintaining it cost more than abandoning it, built a modest life through patient accumulation of honest work. The detective story that had dominated several years of his life had ended quietly, without dramatic resolution or clear victory. Justice had been partial. Truth had been acknowledged incompletely. The guilty had been punished selectively. But corruption had been exposed. And the exposure mattered, even when punishment failed. Sometimes that was enough. Samuel thought about the question Widow Parsons had asked years ago. Was it worth it? The answer remained complicated. He'd sacrificed prosperity for principle, stability for honesty, easy success for difficult integrity. In purely material terms, the sacrifice seemed foolish, but material terms weren't the only measure. Master Hewitt had taught him that a craftsman's mark meant something beyond commercial identification. It was promise, signature, and legacy bound together. Samuel's mark had been tested by forgery and vindicated by truth. That vindication mattered in ways he couldn't fully articulate, but felt deeply. The morning would bring more work, apprentices to train, barrels to complete, customers to satisfy, tools to maintain. The endless cycle of craft that had structured his life since childhood would continue until age or injury forced him to stop. Then William would carry it forward, training his own apprentices, passing along lessons learned from Samuel, who'd learned them from Master Hewitt, who'd learned them from craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose techniques endured. This was how knowledge survived, not through grand monuments or recorded histories, but through patient teaching, careful observation, standards maintained across generations. The work itself was the legacy, more permanent than any individual who performed it. Samuel returned to bed, where Eliza slept peacefully. Outside, the city continued its restless existence. Ships prepared for morning departures. Bakers fired their ovens for the day's bread. Craftsmen woke to another day of labor that would be forgotten by everyone except those who depended on it. The barrel he'd completed that afternoon would hold someone's wine or grain or goods. It would serve its purpose reliably, sealed tight, marked honest. Someone somewhere would benefit from work Samuel had performed without knowing them, without needing gratitude or recognition. That seemed like enough. Perhaps it had always been enough, a life measured not in wealth or fame, but in useful work, honestly performed, standards maintained even when no one watched. The satisfaction of knowing that what you made could be trusted, that your word held weight, that your hands had transformed raw materials into objects that served human need. The measure of a life, Samuel thought drowsily, wasn't how high you climbed, but whether you stood firm when tested. Not what you accumulated, but what you built. Not who remembered your name, but whether your work outlasted your reputation. His mark would circulate through the world long after he was gone, stamped into wood that would eventually decay, but would serve faithfully until then. Generations he'd never know would benefit from standards he'd maintained, from techniques he'd refined, from the simple insistence that good work mattered. The thought brought peace, not the dramatic peace of resolved conflict, but the quiet peace of purposes fulfilled and duties honored. Morning would come. There would be barrels to make. That was enough. It had always been enough. It would remain enough for whatever time remained. Samuel slept and dreamed of wood grain and honest marks and the satisfying sound of hoops driven home true.